I am an ancient scholar, and today I witness a familiar modern tragedy where responsibility is punished, entitlement is rewarded, and silence is mistaken for consent. The main character in this story is Michael Carter, a working professional who built stability slowly, carefully, and without shortcuts, learning early that peace requires boundaries, not applause. Michael's younger brother is Jason Carter, charming in conversation, inconsistent in action, and permanently between opportunities that never quite arrive. Their parents, Richard and Susan Carter, believed deeply in family unity, a belief that often translated into avoiding conflict, even when avoidance quietly produced injustice. What began as temporary help would soon become permanent expectation, and Michael would learn that generosity without limits is rarely remembered as kindness. Michael lived a disciplined life, paid his bills on time, avoided unnecessary drama, and took pride in handling his responsibilities without borrowing comfort from others. He understood that independence was not isolation, but the freedom to choose when and how to help without obligation. Jason, on the other hand, lived reactively, moving from situation to situation, supported by optimism, explanations, and a remarkable ability to land softly. When Jason lost his apartment, the news reached the family, wrapped in sympathy rather than specifics, hardship described without details, urgency without clarity. Richard and Susan acted quickly, not with planning but with instinct, deciding that Jason would move in temporarily until things improved. Temporary in this case was spoken gently and without structure, a word that promised comfort but avoided commitment. No timeline was discussed, no expectations outlined, and no responsibilities assigned because optimism replaced preparation. Michael was not asked whether this plan worked for him. He was informed after it had already been decided. In ancient councils, such announcements signaled authority, but in modern families they arrived disguised as compassion. Jason arrived with bags, confidence, and the unspoken assumption that welcome did not require permission. He selected the larger room without discussion, settled in quickly, and behaved as though the house had always been waiting for him. At first, Michael told himself this was fine, that family helps family, and that patience would smooth the transition. But patience, when unsupported by boundaries, often delays clarity rather than creating it. Small patterns appeared quietly. Dishes left behind, lights left on, food consumed freely, and conversations about future plans that never moved closer. Jason slept late, searched loosely for work, and spoke often about stress instead of solutions. Michael noticed these changes but said nothing, believing early discomfort was temporary and not worth disturbing family peace. Meanwhile, household costs increased predictably. Utilities climbed, groceries vanished faster, and maintenance demands grew. Bills do not understand compassion, and electricity does not pause for emotional hardship. Michael continued paying as usual, unaware that appreciation was slowly being replaced by expectation. Then another phone call arrived, delivered casually, almost politely, as if discussing something already agreed upon. Richard and Susan explained that expenses had risen and that support was needed, their tone calm, reasonable, and confident. They suggested that since Michael earned more and already handled payments, it made sense for him to cover the increase. In ancient law, reason followed consent, but here consent was assumed rather than requested. Michael listened carefully, unsettled not by the request itself, but by how natural it sounded to them. He asked what Jason would be contributing, a simple question that immediately slowed the conversation. The response arrived vaguely. Jason was trying, Jason was stressed, Jason needed time. No plan was offered, no timeline mentioned, and no accountability defined. The responsibility drifted smoothly toward the one person who had never required help. In my era, this would have been called punishment for stability. Michael agreed to help temporarily, driven more by guilt than agreement, hoping generosity would remain optional. But generosity, once normalized, rarely remains a choice. Within weeks, messages arrived listing expenses rather than asking for help. The tone shifted, gratitude faded, and expectations settled comfortably. Jason remained relaxed, the parents remained reassuring, and the bills began finding Michael with increasing confidence. Michael felt an ancient realization forming, the understanding that silence had been interpreted as acceptance. And this is where the true conflict quietly begins. Because when one family member pays to preserve peace, everyone else learns how expensive silence can be. I am an ancient scholar, and I observe that once generosity is accepted without question, it is soon expected without gratitude. Michael Carter noticed the change, not through arguments, but through routine, because entitlement rarely announces itself loudly. The bills arrived with new confidence, electricity higher, groceries larger, expenses expanding as though the house itself had gained expectations. Jason Carter adjusted comfortably to this new arrangement, not as a guest, but as someone who assumed permanence without earning it. He cooked rarely, cleaned selectively, and contributed only conversation, usually about how difficult things felt, rather than how they could improve. Michael watched quietly as patterns hardened. Mornings passed without urgency, afternoons dissolved into distraction, and evenings ended without accountability. When Jason spoke of job searches, they were always just ahead, opportunities almost secured, interviews nearly scheduled. In ancient markets, such promises were called vapor, impressive in speech but useless in trade. Richard and Susan Carter reinforced patience, reminding Michael that family requires understanding, sacrifice, and flexibility. They spoke often of compassion, but never of balance, as though one existed without the other. Michael asked again about contribution, not aggressively but carefully, choosing words that invited discussion rather than resistance. The response was always emotional rather than practical. Jason was stressed. Jason needed space. Jason would contribute when ready. Readiness, Michael learned, is a moving target when comfort is guaranteed. The bills continued arriving addressed to him, not because he agreed, but because he had not refused. In ancient contracts, silence could imply consent, and Michael realized he had signed nothing yet owed everything. His parents framed the situation gently, explaining that Jason needed time and that Michael was in a better position to help. Better position in this case meant stable, responsible, and therefore expandable. Michael noticed that his stability was being treated as communal property rather than personal achievement. He worked longer hours, budgeted tighter, and quietly adjusted his life to accommodate decisions he had not made. When he expressed concern, it was met with reassurance rather than resolution. Richard would say that everything would balance out eventually. Susan would remind him that family comes first. Neither could explain when or how balance would return. Jason, meanwhile, upgraded his comforts. Streaming services appeared. Groceries grew more specific. Electricity usage climbed unapologetically. No one discussed these changes openly because comfort thrives best in ambiguity. Michael felt resentment growing, not explosive but steady, like pressure building behind a sealed door. He questioned himself often, wondering if he was becoming selfish or simply tired. In ancient philosophy, self-doubt is often the weapon of the exploited. Michael proposed a simple solution: shared expenses, defined contributions, and a timeline for independence. The suggestion was met with discomfort, silence, and subtle defensiveness. Jason reacted first, explaining that pressure would only make things worse. Richard and Susan echoed this concern, framing structure as stress rather than fairness. Michael realized then that structure threatened the comfort of everyone except himself. He agreed again to wait, to be patient, to avoid conflict. But patience, once repeated without progress, becomes permission. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into an unspoken assumption. The house no longer felt shared, it felt managed. Michael was not a family member in this arrangement, he was infrastructure. And infrastructure, my listener, is rarely thanked until it fails. This realization settled quietly, heavy and unavoidable, because Michael now understood that unless he changed something, nothing else would. And so the tension moved from background noise to deliberate awareness. The story, as all such stories do, began approaching its turning point. I am an ancient scholar, and I have learned that the first boundary is rarely dramatic, but it is always uncomfortable. After weeks of observation and quiet frustration, Michael Carter decided that silence could no longer serve as strategy. He did not plan a confrontation fueled by anger, because anger clouds authority and invites dismissal. Instead, he prepared a calm conversation, structured, measured, and focused on clarity rather than blame. He spoke first with his parents, Richard and Susan Carter, choosing a moment free from distraction or urgency. Michael explained that the financial arrangement was no longer sustainable, not emotionally, not practically, and not fairly. He outlined the rising costs, the absence of contribution, and the growing imbalance that had become impossible to ignore. His tone remained respectful, but his words carried definition, something the situation had lacked from the beginning. He proposed a clear plan, shared expenses, defined responsibilities, and a timeline for Jason's independence. In ancient assemblies, such proposals were signs of cooperation. Here they were received as disruption. Richard grew quiet, processing not the numbers but the discomfort of confrontation. Susan responded with concern, but not for the imbalance, for the tension the conversation created. She reminded Michael that Jason was struggling, that pressure could cause harm, and that patience was still required. Michael listened carefully and repeated his point, that support without structure had become dependency. This repetition shifted the tone. The conversation moved from discussion to defense. Richard suggested that Michael was focusing too much on money. Susan implied that his boundaries felt cold. In ancient teachings, boundaries are often labeled cruelty by those who benefit from their absence. Michael clarified that boundaries were not rejection, but conditions. He explained that continued support required shared responsibility, not silent expectation. The room fell quiet, not in agreement, but in resistance. When Jason joined the conversation later, the mood changed further. Jason listened with visible discomfort as expectations were finally spoken aloud. He responded emotionally, explaining that he felt attacked, pressured, and misunderstood. He spoke of stress, anxiety, and how difficult his situation already felt. But he avoided addressing timelines, contributions, or accountability. Michael noticed this avoidance clearly. In ancient debates, evasion was considered admission. Jason argued that Michael's stability gave him more capacity to help. That argument landed heavily. Michael realized that his success was being used as justification for unequal responsibility. He responded calmly, stating that earning more did not mean owing more. The statement altered the dynamic. The conversation ended without resolution because agreement was no longer the goal. The boundary had been introduced, and boundaries once spoken cannot be unheard. The following days carried a noticeable shift. The house felt tense, conversation shortened, politeness replaced warmth. Jason became quieter but no more responsible. Richard and Susan grew distant, disappointed rather than understanding. Michael felt the weight of being labeled difficult for insisting on fairness. In ancient history, reformers were rarely thanked. But despite the discomfort, something had changed. The silence was gone, and with it, the illusion that this arrangement could continue unchanged. The turning point had been reached, and the cost of clarity was only beginning to reveal itself. I am an ancient scholar, and I have seen many disputes where logic fails not because it is weak, but because emotion is used as a shield. After the boundary was spoken, the household did not return to normal because normal had depended on Michael Carter's silence. The tension did not explode immediately. Instead, it settled into the walls, quiet, heavy, and deliberate. Richard and Susan Carter became distant, not hostile, but disappointed, the kind of disappointment meant to correct behavior. They spoke less about solutions and more about feelings, shifting the focus away from fairness and toward emotional impact. Susan reminded Michael how difficult Jason's life had been, recounting past struggles as justification for present imbalance. She spoke of compassion, empathy and understanding, but never of responsibility. Richard framed the situation as unfortunate timing, suggesting that pushing now could cause permanent damage. In ancient rhetoric, this technique is known as emotional leverage. Jason's behavior shifted subtly, not toward responsibility, but toward victimhood. He withdrew socially, sighed often, and spoke quietly about pressure when others were present. He made sure his discomfort was visible, but his effort remained absent. When Michael entered a room, conversations paused briefly, then resumed cautiously. The atmosphere suggested that boundaries had offended something sacred. Michael felt the familiar pull of guilt, not because he was wrong, but because guilt is designed to punish clarity. He questioned whether he should ease his stance, reduce expectations, or simply wait longer. In ancient texts, this moment is called the test of resolve. Michael resisted the urge to apologize for wanting fairness. He reminded himself that asking for contribution was not cruelty. Still, the pressure continued. Susan began mentioning how stressed Jason was becoming, how fragile his situation felt. Richard suggested that Michael's tone had changed, even though his words had not. This reframing turned boundaries into character flaws. Jason spoke privately to Michael, explaining that the conversation had made him feel unsafe and unwelcome. He said he needed support, not deadlines. Michael listened, then calmly repeated the same expectations. He explained that support without direction was no longer possible. This response frustrated Jason, who accused Michael of prioritizing money over family. In ancient disputes, accusations often replace arguments when justification fails. Michael noticed that no one asked how the situation was affecting him. His increased workload, reduced savings, and emotional strain were treated as invisible. He was expected to endure quietly because endurance had become his assigned role. The bills continued arriving unchanged, confident in their destination. Jason made no meaningful progress toward independence. Richard and Susan avoided further discussions, believing time might soften Michael's resolve. But time only clarified the imbalance. Michael felt something shift internally. The guilt that once weighed heavily began to lose its power. He recognized that guilt was being used not to heal, but to preserve comfort. In ancient philosophy, guilt without accountability is manipulation. This realization did not bring peace, but it brought certainty. Michael understood that waiting longer would not improve the situation. It would only reinforce the lesson that boundaries were negotiable. And once boundaries become negotiable, they cease to exist. The house grew quieter, but the conflict grew sharper, because beneath the silence, decisions were forming. And the next step would no longer be a request. I am an ancient scholar, and I have learned that boundaries spoken without consequence are often mistaken for suggestions rather than decisions. After weeks of emotional pressure and unresolved tension, Michael Carter reached a point where patience no longer felt like virtue, but like self-betrayal. He understood that repeating the same expectations without enforcing them had taught everyone around him a dangerous lesson. That lesson was simple. Discomfort would always belong to him, while comfort would remain untouched for everyone else. Michael did not arrive at this realization suddenly. It formed slowly through exhaustion, financial strain, and the quiet resentment that builds when fairness is delayed. He reviewed his expenses carefully, calculating how much of his income had been redirected toward decisions he never agreed to. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were constant, and constancy is how imbalance becomes normal. Michael recognized that continuing this way would eventually reshape his entire life around avoidance rather than intention. He decided that clarity could no longer exist without consequence. When he spoke again with Richard and Susan Carter, his tone remained calm, but his message carried finality. He explained that he would no longer cover increased household expenses unless Jason began contributing immediately. He outlined a clear plan, shared bills, specific amounts, and a defined timeline for Jason to regain independence. This time, he did not frame it as a suggestion, but as a condition. In ancient law, Conditions establish authority where kindness has failed. The response was immediate discomfort. Susan expressed concern that Michael was being too rigid, that life did not always follow schedules. Richard warned that forcing the issue could damage family relationships permanently. Michael listened without interruption, then explained that relationships built on avoidance were already damaged. He clarified that fairness was not hostility and structure was not cruelty. When Jason joined the discussion, the reaction intensified. Jason accused Michael of threatening stability and creating pressure during an already difficult time. He spoke emotionally about anxiety, uncertainty, and feeling unwanted. But again, he avoided addressing responsibility, contribution, or timelines. Michael noticed that every argument Jason offered protected comfort rather than progress. He responded calmly, stating that support would continue only alongside accountability. This response angered Jason, who interpreted limits as rejection. In ancient disputes, rejection is often claimed when entitlement is challenged. The conversation ended without agreement, but the power dynamic had shifted. Michael had stopped negotiating. The following days were tense and quiet, but noticeably different. Jason's behavior did not improve, but his confidence diminished. Richard and Susan withdrew emotionally, disappointed that Michael had not yielded. The bills continued to arrive, but Michael no longer paid them automatically. For the first time, the household experienced delay rather than compliance. This delay unsettled everyone. Michael felt the discomfort deeply, but he also felt relief. He understood that discomfort was no longer his alone to carry. In ancient wisdom, balance is restored when burden is redistributed. Jason attempted to test Michael's resolve, delaying conversations, avoiding commitments, and hoping time would soften enforcement. But Michael remained consistent, repeating the same conditions without emotion. Consistency, more than confrontation, communicates seriousness. As days passed, it became clear that the old arrangement was ending. Jason could no longer remain comfortable without change. Richard and Susan realized that reassurance would not dissolve consequence. The house felt different now, not peaceful but honest. Michael understood that this honesty came at a cost. But he also understood that peace purchased through self-sacrifice was never sustainable, and so the situation approached its final stage. Because when conditions are enforced, choices must finally be made, and the next choice would no longer belong to Michael alone. I'm an ancient scholar, and I have witnessed that when comfort is threatened, resistance reveals its true shape. Once Michael Carter stopped absorbing consequences alone, the household entered a new and unstable phase. The silence that followed his enforcement was no longer passive. It was strategic, waiting to see if resolve would weaken. Jason Carter reacted first, not with accountability, but with escalation disguised as emotion. He became openly frustrated, pacing the house, sighing loudly, and speaking often about how unfair everything felt. He accused Michael of changing suddenly, ignoring the months of patience that preceded enforcement. In ancient disputes, escalation often follows the loss of advantage. Jason attempted to renegotiate indirectly, suggesting smaller contributions, vague promises, and undefined timelines. These offers lacked structure because structure would have required commitment. Michael listened without interruption, then calmly repeated the same conditions. This consistency unsettled Jason more than confrontation ever could. Richard and Susan Carter soon intervened, sensing that the situation was slipping beyond reassurance. They requested another family discussion, hoping that collective pressure might soften Michael's position. When they spoke, the focus shifted away from fairness and toward emotional consequence. Susan expressed fear that the conflict would permanently fracture the family. Richard warned that Michael's insistence might push Jason into deeper difficulty. Neither addressed the reality that the current arrangement was already harming Michael. Michael responded carefully, explaining that the family was already fractured just unevenly. He stated that his boundaries were not new, only newly enforced. This distinction was uncomfortable because it removed the illusion of misunderstanding. Jason reacted sharply, accusing Michael of choosing money over brotherhood. In ancient rhetoric, this is known as false equivalence. Michael replied calmly that responsibility was not abandonment and accountability was not rejection. The conversation grew tense. Voices rose slightly and emotion replaced logic. Yet Michael remained composed, repeating his position without deviation. He explained that continued support required immediate contribution and a clear plan for independence. Anything less would end financial assistance entirely. This statement altered the atmosphere decisively. For the first time, consequences were unmistakable. Jason withdrew angrily, retreating into silence rather than solution. Richard and Susan appeared shaken, realizing that persuasion had failed. The following days were marked by discomfort rather than resolution. Jason avoided Michael, hoping distance might erode enforcement. Richard and Susan attempted smaller appeals, reminders of family history, shared memories, and past sacrifices. In ancient times, such appeals were used when arguments were exhausted. Michael acknowledged the memories, but did not change the conditions. He understood that bending now would erase everything he had established. The bills continued to arrive, unpaid and increasingly urgent. The household felt suspended between decision and consequence. Jason's comfort was no longer guaranteed, and anxiety replaced entitlement. Michael felt pressure from all sides, but for the first time he did not carry it alone. He recognized that firmness had redistributed discomfort more fairly. In ancient wisdom, this redistribution marks the beginning of resolution. The situation had reached a point where avoidance was no longer possible. Jason would need to act, or consequences would follow. And the next action would determine whether this family adjusted or fractured openly. I am an ancient scholar, and I have observed that when comfort can no longer be maintained through avoidance, reality enters without asking permission. As the pressure mounted and the bills remained unpaid, Jason Carter was finally forced to confront a situation he had delayed for months. The house that once felt effortless now carried tension in every room. Because comfort without contribution had reached its limit, Jason attempted one final adjustment, not toward responsibility, but toward negotiation. He suggested partial payments without structure, promises without dates, and effort without verification. In ancient bargaining, such offers were known as delay tactics, designed to preserve advantage rather than resolve imbalance. Michael Carter listened carefully, then declined calmly, repeating that conditions had already been defined and would not be revised. This refusal marked a clear shift because Jason could no longer rely on ambiguity to protect his position. Frustration replaced confidence, and entitlement gave way to visible anxiety. Richard and Susan Carter intervened once more, hoping to salvage peace before consequences became unavoidable. They suggested compromises, shared sacrifice, and temporary exceptions, each proposal carefully avoiding accountability. Michael acknowledged their concern, then explained that compromise without responsibility only extended the problem. He reminded them that fairness delayed too long becomes injustice. This statement unsettled the room because it reframed patience as harm rather than virtue. Jason reacted sharply, accusing Michael of forcing him into an impossible situation. He argued that immediate contribution was unrealistic and that pressure would only worsen his circumstances. Michael replied evenly that pressure was not new. It had simply been redistributed. In ancient philosophy, this moment is known as the unveiling, when comfort can no longer hide dependency. The discussion ended without agreement, but with clarity. Jason was given a final choice: contribute immediately under defined terms, or prepare to leave. This choice carried weight because it was real. For the first time, Jason understood that remaining required effort rather than tolerance. The days that followed were marked by visible stress. Jason searched urgently for solutions, not out of ambition, but necessity. Richard and Susan withdrew emotionally, recognizing that reassurance could no longer delay outcome. The household felt suspended between resolution and rupture. Michael remained steady, resisting the urge to soften conditions despite discomfort. He understood that wavering now would invalidate every boundary established. In ancient governance, consistency is the language of authority. Jason delayed again, hoping time might create opportunity where action had not, but deadlines arrived quietly and without emotion. When the final date passed without progress, the decision became unavoidable. Michael informed his parents calmly that he would no longer subsidize the household under any circumstances. He explained that this was not punishment, but consequence. This distinction mattered because punishment seeks control, while consequence restores balance. Jason reacted with disbelief, anger, and accusation. He claimed betrayal, abandonment, and cruelty. Michael listened without interruption because explanations had already been given. The house grew silent as the weight of the decision settled. Comfort had ended, and responsibility had arrived, and with it, the final stage of this conflict began. I am an ancient scholar, and I have learned that when consequences finally arrive, they do not shout. They simply replace illusion with reality. After Michael Carter withdrew financial support, the household entered a period of uncomfortable clarity. The familiar comforts that had once felt permanent now required effort, planning, and accountability. Jason Carter was forced to act, not because he had suddenly changed, but because avoidance no longer worked. He began making arrangements to leave, not with dignity, but with resentment. Packing slowly and speaking little, the house felt quieter, not peaceful yet, but honest in a way it had not been for months. Richard and Susan Carter struggled with mixed emotions, relief that tension was ending, and regret that it had reached this point. They avoided direct conversation with Michael at first, unsure whether authority should be acknowledged or resented. In ancient families, elders often mistook harmony for silence, and silence for success. When Jason finally moved out, there was no dramatic farewell, only the absence of noise where entitlement once lived. The bills stabilized, the house returned to balance, and responsibility found its proper place again. Michael felt conflicting emotions, relief, sadness, and a quiet exhaustion that followed prolonged restraint. He questioned whether things could have ended differently, whether patience extended further might have softened the outcome. In ancient wisdom, such questions are common after enforcement, but they do not erase necessity. Richard and Susan eventually spoke with Michael, acknowledging that boundaries had been avoided for too long. They admitted that protecting comfort had allowed imbalance to grow unchecked. This admission did not repair everything, but it restored honesty. Jason maintained distance afterward, framing the outcome as betrayal rather than consequence. In many stories, those confronted with responsibility preferred distance to reflection. Michael accepted this without argument, understanding that clarity often costs closeness. He recognized that peace restored through boundaries feels different than peace purchased through silence. One is quiet because it is balanced, the other because someone is enduring. In ancient teachings, endurance without justice is not virtue, it is erosion. Michael rebuilt his routines, strengthened his boundaries, and reclaimed the stability he had nearly surrendered. He learned that helping others must never require abandoning oneself, and that family unity sustained by imbalance is not unity, but delay. My judgment is this: when generosity is demanded, it ceases to be generosity. When boundaries are punished, silence becomes expensive. And when responsibility is avoided long enough, consequence will arrive without apology. If these modern conflicts, viewed through ancient reason, offer you clarity or quiet reflection, then remain here. Subscribe to this channel, where modern problems are judged slowly, without noise and without confusion. More stories will come, where entitlement is weighed against responsibility and silence is questioned rather than praised. Until the next judgment arrives, walk wisely, guard your boundaries, and remember that peace is earned through balance, not sacrifice.